Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from the new Pornographers called In the Morse Code of Brake Lights. So here's a fun question. How much do people really consider the new Pornographers these days? Because I'd argue that's relevant, as past and present solo members like Nico Case and Dan Bejar as Destroyer, they have charted critically acclaimed territory in recent years that many could argue outstrips the band's original run of insane quality in the first half of the 2000s. And while I look back on projects like Brill Bruisers and Whiteout Conditions this decade with a lot of fondness, it's more for snippets of anthemic brilliance rather than a consistently strong but never quite transcendent whole. And that's not even that this supergroup feels like a hangout project or anything like that for prodigious talents to bounce ideas off each other. Especially in recent years, a lot of AC Newman's writing has had a sense of urgency that keeps things driving with more momentum and outright anxiety than you normally see for acts 20 years into their careers. They are not taking this album lightly. Maybe it's just the political subtext lurking just out of frame, maybe it's middle age. Either way, it has led to some phenomenal songs, and while Dan Bejar only contributes co-writing credits to a single song here, he's not technically part of the band anymore. I've always thought that the new Pornographers can knock at least a couple tracks out of the park per album. So, okay, what do we get from In the Morse Code of Brake Lights? Well, this is gonna sound a lot worse than it actually is. The new Pornographers made a very good album, and I'm not as excited or riveted by it as I want to be. Now, part of it is a natural outgrowth from it not quite having songs that would become locks on my year-end list in the same way that Whiteout Conditions did, and I wouldn't say any song here quite reaches that level, and yet it's strong enough across the board to wind up skidding towards greatness all the same, which is something that a lot of bands with a lot less talent could never pull off. In other words, this is a very good project, but I struggle calling it great. And what's fascinating is that the group effectively reached this point by continuing along the same anxious but seething trajectory that made the abstract writing of Whiteout Conditions so gripping for me. Hell, with more focus this time around, I would argue it's even better. Many critics have highlighted the lingering sense of apocalyptic dread lurking both in the delivery and a lot of the lyrical subtext. But that's more because keeping one's head down amidst the chaos on the last project, it's curdled into increasingly reckless, increasingly bold strikes, although never quite bold enough to put some real teeth to that revolution. That's something that's kind of irked me about AC Newman's writing in the past. It might be more realistic for folks of his age to simply subsist and live under increasingly authoritarian times, and he's gonna plant the warning for the crackdown across the sudden knock and higher beams, but across an album laced with this sort of tension, I kept waiting for the breaking point that never really came. An album that needs giants to fight the Colossus in the room instead of being or building their own. Now, that's not saying that there isn't a place for taking the long view and subsisting. The anxiety and comfort between partners on falling down the stairs of your smile, it is potent and needed in times like these, as is the weary burnout on Dreamlike and On the Rush that's still trying to make a mark on history, and in both searching for direction on You Need a Backseat Driver, sealing one's own reckless moment on Opening Ceremony, and tiredly acknowledging the cyclical nature of history on Leather of the Seat. These are canny and wise observations, necessities for an album that feels constantly on the move. But it's also a project that feels like it's pulling some of its punchlines. It'll keep moving, it'll keep its head down as a survival tactic, but never quite seizes the day or ratchets up the gear, a little bit too prim to be properly revolutionary. Now again, some of this might be a factor of my own attitude, leaning more on the shredder side of the spectrum right now when it comes to political action, and I'm not going to deny the accessibility and wisdom of this method to a larger audience, because hell, it has worked for them. But for a band that seems to acknowledge that this time the storm just feels more precarious, you keep expecting to hear a breaking point either in the text or the production or even the subtext, and it never quite comes, and that can mean there's a little bit of a lack of payoff. Now granted, some of that would be inevitable with some of the shift in production and instrumentation, which might be best described as a return to a modern, relatively conventionally structured power pop indie rock sound in comparison with the harder synth rock rock tones that drove their last two projects, augmented by the dramatic strings brought in by their new violinist, Simi Stone. And with a continued focus on momentum and groove, and the fact that the band can stack up vocal harmonies pretty consistently, and honestly, they sound really good, even if the mixing can feel kind of muddy across those vocals and really a lot of the cymbals, it means that it's hard for me to dislike a lot of these songs, even if the sparkle or edge of the mix feels kind of muted. I really like how the darker minor rattles transition to a much brighter melody on You'll Need a Backseat Driver. I love the thickness of the bass line that drives that song, and a lot of the watery tunes around Falling Down the Stairs of Your Smile, and the sweeping synth strings flourishes of Colossus of Rhodes with its pummeling groove. It's one of the most dramatic moments on the album. I get why some people might not be into it, but I really liked it. And the album ends well, taking those same synth strings across the internal change-ups of Leather on the Seat. Although, I place a lot more credit there on Nico Case's range as a singer. She sounds phenomenal across this album. And while Need Some Giants does feel like a retread of power pop melodies that Nico Case already pushed on Bad Luck from Hell On last year, which felt a little bit like leftovers from Caseling Bears, especially with some of those backing vocals, it is still pretty sticky, even if the hook kind of sounds runny in its tone. And really, that is the larger issue with the project. A lot of drippy tones that just do not have the same punch even if the solid compositions are there. And it takes away from the tightness that's always been this band's hallmark in their pop focus. The choice of guitars on higher beams that don't quite work, the acoustics that are bizarrely giving no warmth to the watery effects around Opening Ceremony, the weirdly hollow mixing across You Won't Need Those Where You're Going, and the cluttered blending of guitars and keyboards on One Kind of Solomon that might have a really great bridge, but doesn't really have a solid harmony for that hook. I mean, I guess the larger problem is that while the percussion and grooves will cut through with some real sharpness, the melodies can feel a little overmixed and kind of unbalanced, and that does hurt a significant swath across the middle of the album. It feels flabbier than it really should. But as a whole, look, okay, I like this album, and I'm willing even to say that as a whole, it is slightly better than Whiteout Conditions, albeit without those great highs. But the more listens I gave it, the more I was just convinced that I just could not call this great. And what's all the more frustrating is that it feels like an album that was just a few tentative steps from really getting there, but pulled back at the last second from really pushing through, instrumentally and lyrically. There could have been more bites, and they just don't get there. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think this is really good, and it's getting a solid 7 out of 10 for me, but greatness was possible, and considering we're on the second project from the new Pornographers that are extrapolating a lot of driving metaphors, I like to hear this band leading that convoy. That's all. I know they can do it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know I'm late to the punch with this one. It was a tough album to contextualize. Pretty much I was late to the last new Pornographers album because this sort of abstract lyricism, you kind of do need to sit with it and really take it in. And melodically, there was a lot going on. But if you want to buy or stream it, links down in the description below. And I have the poll up there. I am curious where new Pornographers fans will fall on this project, because again, I've seen it being kind of divisive among the fandom. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you're looking for episodes of Billboard Breakdown or other album reviews, links are in the card right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.